Welcome to the deep dive. Truly being well-informed isn't just about collecting facts. It's about actually grasping how things operate in the real world.
Mm.
And often, some of those, profound insights into really complex issues can come from looking at them through the lens of what seem like surprisingly simple economic concepts.
Yeah, that's where the real understanding often begins, doesn't it? In seeing the often hidden chains of cause and effect that play out, not just the immediate visible outcome.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's precisely our mission today. We're taking a deep dive into some key excerpts from Thomas Sowell's book, Applied Economics.
Sure.
We're going to pull out his central ideas, especially the critical power of thinking, beyond just the first consequence, or stage one, as he puts it, and how different incentives fundamentally shape outcomes.
Right, and how those incentives play out.
Then we'll see how he applies these concepts to areas you might not expect economics to shed light on, like politics, labor markets, healthcare, housing. It's all about finding those powerful nuggets of insight hidden in real-world situations.
What I find particularly striking about Sowell's approach here is how applying these fundamental, sometimes deceptively simple principles really rigorously allows you to cut through a lot of noise.
Yeah, see the underlying dynamics.
Exactly.
Okay, let's unpack this. He starts with a fundamental idea. Incremental decisions.
Yeah.
It's not usually about an all-or-nothing choice.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Decisions are typically made at the margin. You're deciding whether to acquire another increment of something, whether that's, say, a second car or a slightly larger house or even more safety
And you weigh that
against the cost of giving up something else. So, for example, getting that second home might mean giving up sending a child to a particular college or maybe some travel plans you had.
So it's always about that trade-off at the margin, the opportunity cost.
Precisely. And this is why many desirable things actually remain unpurchased. Not because they're inherently bad, but because the next unit of that thing is almost, but, not quite worth what you have to give up to get it.
You're constantly evaluating.
Constantly weighing that marginal benefit against the marginal cost.
Yeah. That leads directly into the central theme of the book, doesn't it?
Right.
Thinking beyond stage one. This seems incredibly important, but also, difficult to do consistently.
Oh, it is. It really is. Sowell tells his classic anecdote about his time as an undergraduate. He enthusiastically proposed some policy outlining its intended immediate positive effects. And his professor, Arthur Smithies, simply asked him, "And then what will happen?"
Wow. Just that.
Just that. And that single question forced Sowell to consider the subsequent ripple effects throughout the economy, which, turned out to be quite negative in his example. It actually made the initial problem worse.
And then what will happen? It's such a deceptively simple question, but it's packed with power, isn't it?
It really forces you past that initial, often politically appealing effect. The text notes that people who served as economic advisors to presidents like Nixon and Clinton observed how little consideration was often given to long-range economic consequences at the highest political levels. Yeah, those presidents were clearly focused on winning re-election, which, requires thinking ahead.
Sure, you have to think ahead to get reelected.
Right, but perhaps more about the political stage 2 and 3, rather than the economic ones.
Ah, so it's not that politicians never think ahead. It's what they're incentivized to think ahead about.
That's a key point from the text, yes. And this becomes critical when the effects of a policy unfold over years. If the initial results look good, and the bad ones come much later, perhaps safely after the next election cycle,
And the incentive is clear.
the political incentive structure strongly favors adopting that policy, even if the long-term economic damage might be severe.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. Applying this idea of one-stage thinking to the dynamics between politics and economics. Politicians seem to respond more directly to immediate public pressure and perception, right? Which is often based on that visible first stage.
Yeah, because public perception and, frankly, media coverage tend to focus on those immediate effects. The political payoff is in delivering something tangible now, even if the real economic cost accrues much later.
Okay, take the example Sowell uses. A city or state raising taxes on profitable local corporations. Walk us through the multi-stage consequences he describes there.
Okay, so stage 1. The immediate effect is, boom, an increase in tax revenue for the local government.
Money for projects. Looks good.
Exactly. This can fund visible local stuff, which is politically popular, wins votes. And the corporations, well, they don't just vanish overnight. You can't just pick up a factory and move it instantly.
Right, that initial injection of cash feels like a win.
It does. But then stage 2 begins to unfold. Those higher taxes start to reduce the profitability of operating in that location.
Makes sense.
This starts to decrease the corporation's incentive to invest locally, and it also reduces the locally earned income generated by the corporation and its employees, which in turn impacts other local taxes too.
Okay, so less investment, less economic activity sort of simmering below the surface now.
Then stage 3 hits. When these corporations are planning for expansion or maybe building new operations, they are now much less likely to choose that high-tax location.
They look elsewhere.
They'll choose to locate somewhere else, potentially transferring willing employees, hiring new ones in lower tax areas. Now, this is a slower process, right? It happens over years.
A gradual bleeding of opportunity.
Precisely. And finally, stage 4. As fewer new businesses locate there and existing ones potentially shrink or relocate over time, the total tax revenues collected from corporations can eventually fall below what they were before the tax rate was increased.
Seriously. Below the original level.
Yeah, because now there are simply fewer businesses left to pay any taxes at all.
Wow. So the initial political win turns into a long-term economic loss. And by stage 4, the politicians who push the tax hike might be, out of office or somewhere else entirely.
Exactly. Their political timeline didn't necessarily align with the full economic consequences unfolding.
That vivid analogy of emptying a dam really brings this point home, doesn't it?
It's a powerful one. Imagine you have a dam, right? And you calculate that if you release all the water, the valley floor will eventually be covered to a depth of, say, 20 feet.
Okay.
Now, if you manage the release slowly and carefully, thinking about timing and sequence, the water rises gradually, and maybe your home at 30 feet elevation is perfectly safe.
Right. Manageable.
But if you just fling open the floodgates all at once, you don't get a gradual rise. You get this massive, maybe 40-foot destructive wave that just sweeps through the valley, demolishing everything in its path.
Even though the final water level is the same.
Even though the water will eventually settle at that same 20-foot depth. The process and the timing of getting there makes all the difference between, manageable change and utter devastation.
So the same theoretical outcome, but a completely different reality based on how you get there.
That's the core idea. And the text mentions a Nobel laureate economist who argued that some sudden, sweeping policy changes imposed by the IMF on certain third-world countries ignored this critical factor of timing and sequence.
And caused damage.
Unleashed a kind of destructive wave that caused potentially irreparable damage to social stability and scared away necessary investment for years to come.
We see this short-term political focus play out in other ways too, don't we? Like politicians competing by promising or giving away free goods and services.
Oh, yeah. The India example in the text is quite telling. A chief minister in Punjab who apparently engaged in such extensive populism that he nearly bankrupted the state treasury.
Wow.
Even Prime Minister Rao is noted as having to slow down necessary economic reforms because he quickly realized the votes were, they were in popular handouts, not in making tough long-term decisions.
It forces you to ask, where does the money come from for basic, necessary long-term investments like schools, infrastructure, if the current revenue is just being given away for immediate political gain?
It really highlights that disconnect. And sometimes the political calculus seems to prioritize image even over, addressing real suffering.
That example from the 1999 Orissa supercyclone is particularly grim.
It is. With official death tolls already in the thousands and likely many more uncounted, the central government in Delhi reportedly delayed seeking international help. While the speculation mentioned in the text was that this might have been done to avoid appearing incompetent or needing outside assistance, despite the fact that many villages were cut off for weeks without relief.
So prioritizing national pride or political optics over immediate aid to its own citizens in desperate need.
That's the implication presented.
Okay, let's take this multi-stage thinking framework and apply it to a specific case mentioned in the book, the California electricity crisis back in 2001-2002. What was the situation leading up to that?
Okay, so the basic context was rising costs for actually generating electricity. There was reduced output from cheaper hydroelectric sources because of lower rainfall.
Right, drought conditions.
And the prices of fuels like oil and natural gas were going up. Now, in a normal market, those rising costs would naturally translate into higher prices for consumers.
Signaling them to use less.
Exactly. Signaling conservation. But that's not how it went down in California, right?
Not at all. Stage 1. California politicians intervened. They imposed legal caps on how high electricity prices could rise for consumers.
Okay. Price controls.
The intention was clearly to protect consumers from those price increases. But what this policy effectively did was tell consumers that the cost of electricity hadn't really changed, even though the underlying generation costs had gone up significantly.
So people kept using electricity like nothing was wrong, assuming it was cheap and readily available.
Exactly, which led directly to stage two, blackouts. With rising costs for the utility companies but legally capped retail prices, consumers were demanding more electricity that was actually available at those controlled prices.
Demand outstripped supply.
Inevitable blackouts began to occur across the state. Rolling blackouts.
Stage 3. Panic. The blackouts caused widespread disruption to homes, businesses. Politicians started to panic, right? They worried about companies leaving the state because the power was unreliable.
Losing jobs, tax revenue,
And, of course, severely impacting their own re-election chances.
and stage four.
Utility companies started going bankrupt. They were legally required to buy electricity from wholesalers at high market prices, but forced to sell it to consumers at those capped low prices. It was unsustainable.
So the wholesalers stopped supplying.
Well, yeah, wholesalers, quite rationally, weren't willing to keep supplying power to companies that couldn't actually pay their bills. The entire system was just collapsing.
And the ultimate outcome. What happened then?
The governor had to step in and use state funds, taxpayer money, to buy electricity directly from the wholesalers just to keep the power on.
So the cost didn't disappear.
It showed that the underlying high costs hadn't vanished at all. The initial attempt to hide those costs through price controls had merely delayed and, frankly, magnified the problem, ultimately leading to a much larger cost and a systemic failure.
It really underscores how ignoring the underlying economic reality, even with maybe the best intentions, can lead to a far, far worse outcome.
Prices in a market economy are conveyors of that reality. Suppressing them doesn't make the costs disappear, it just distorts the signals and creates different, often more severe problems down the road.
Let's transition now to labor markets. So Will talks about free and unfree labor. What are the core advantages of a free labor market from this economic perspective?
Well, at its core, a free labor market tends to allocate labor efficiently. Because pay is generally linked to productivity, workers have an incentive to move to jobs where their skills are most valued and where they can contribute the most.
And that benefits everyone.
Ultimately, it benefits consumers because it leads to the production of the goods and services people want efficiently and at lower prices.
Of course, no one's arguing for a completely unrestricted market. Society imposes necessary limits, right? Like child labor laws or licensing for highly skilled roles like surgeons.
Absolutely. Or simply banning activities society deems criminal, like, burglary. But within those necessary constraints, the market process tends to move labor toward its highest valued uses.
How does human capital fit into this? And is there a connection to thinking beyond stage one here, too?
Human capital, basically, your accumulated knowledge, skills, experience, is fundamental to your value in the labor market. And yes, thinking beyond stage one is absolutely crucial for building it.
How so?
Acquiring valuable human capital often requires taking a lower-paying job initially, precisely because that job offers the opportunity to learn and gain experience that will pay off later.
So someone might take a modest entry-level job, not just for the immediate paycheck, but for the future potential, like an investment in themselves.
Exactly. The text gives examples like Frank Woolworth sweeping floors in a store he would eventually own, or people taking, say, modestly paid administrative roles in regulatory agencies, specifically to learn the system before moving to much higher-paying jobs in the industries they used to regulate.
Or postdocs.
Or postdoctoral fellows accepting very low pay at prestigious universities to work with top researchers, boosting their reputation and skills for a future senior position. Stage 1 pain for stage 2 or 3 gain.
And the text suggests those who kind of disdain low-paying entry jobs might not be thinking in these multi-stage terms.
That's the argument presented, yeah. They're perhaps only seeing the stage 1 paycheck, not the stage 2 and 3 accumulation of human capital that could lead to much greater lifetime earnings and opportunity down the line.
And there was a study mentioned.
Yeah, a study on top wealth holders starting part-time work early also points in this direction. They were building experience and work habits from a young age.
So this popular idea of fixed classes isn't quite right in a dynamic free market, according to this view.
According to this perspective, no. Professor Peter Bauer is quoted observing that British industry has been managed for decades by new men who rise from relatively modest beginnings. Income mobility, driven by acquiring human capital and responding to market signals, is seen as the norm in free markets, not the exception, despite maybe popular narratives suggesting otherwise.
What about factors outside the worker themselves that affect their value? especially in developing countries, these external costs.
Yes, that's a huge factor. Poor infrastructure, like bad roads or unreliable rail systems, significantly increases the cost of getting goods produced by workers to the market.
And corruption.
High levels of corruption requiring bribes add further costs. A worker's value to an employer isn't just their raw productivity, it's based on the net value their output provides after all these external costs are subtracted. So even if the worker is personally very productive, their value to the employer is reduced by these external factors.
How does this play out with multinational corporations operating in developing countries? They often pay more than local wages, but less than back home.
Right. They often pay maybe double the local average wage, offering significantly better opportunities than strictly local employers. However, if these companies are forced, maybe through law or external pressure, to pay wages significantly higher than the actual value the worker's output adds, after accounting for those external costs,
Then it doesn't make economic sense for them.
it can become economically unsustainable for the company to hire those workers, which leads to an unintended consequence.
A very significant one, presumably.
Yeah. The workers lose jobs that were actually better paying than the local alternatives, and they also lose the opportunity to acquire valuable human capital by working in these often more efficient, technologically advanced enterprises. So the policy intended to improve their wages can end up reducing their total opportunities.
Let's look at another policy intended to provide security that apparently has surprising unintended consequences. Academic tenure. The stated goal is obviously greater job security for faculty.
That's the clear stage one goal, yes. But the actual outcome for many young faculty, particularly at top research institutions, can paradoxically be less job security.
That seems totally counterintuitive. How does that work?
Well, because tenure represents a very long-term, very significant financial commitment for a university, potentially over $1 million over a professor's career span. This immense commitment forces universities to be incredibly stringent, extremely careful in their up or out decisions for untenured faculty.
So they have to be really sure about future performance before making that huge commitment.
Precisely. Even just satisfactory performance by an assistant professor might not be enough. If there isn't compelling evidence soon enough that they will reach the higher performance levels expected of tenured faculty, particularly in research output,
They let them go.
the university is strongly incentivized to let them go to avoid that massive long-term financial risk. It's a rational response to the high cost of the tenure commitment.
And this explains why at many top universities, it's actually common for a majority of assistant professors not to get tenure.
Yes, their current work is often perfectly good, even excellent. But the tenure decision is a much, much higher hurdle. It requires strong evidence of future exceptional performance. So the policy intended to create job security for a tenured few ends up, arguably, reducing it for the untenured many in those crucial early career years.
Switching gears a bit to crime, the book discusses the rationality of criminals. How is this demonstrated?
Well, the argument is that criminal behavior, like most behavior, responds to incentives, specifically the perceived costs and benefits of the crime. These costs include not just legal penalties, but also the danger posed by potential victims.
And the comparison is between Britain and the U.S.
Yeah, the comparison of burglary rates and burglar behavior in Britain versus the U.S. is used as an illustration, particularly regarding gun control laws.
How does that factor in?
Because of stricter gun control laws, burglars in Britain face a much lower perceived risk of encountering an armed homeowner compared to the U.S. Consequently, the text notes, burglary rates are higher in Britain, and British burglars are apparently less likely to case a premises beforehand to check if someone is home.
Because the risk is lower if they do encounter someone.
The perceived cost of encountering someone unexpectedly is lower. So the argument is both groups of burglars are behaving rationally given their respective environments and the incentives they face.
And crime rates generally seem to vary inversely with the risk of imprisonment.
The text points to legal reforms in the U.S. back in the 1960s that significantly reduced the likelihood of actual jail time for a given crime. This period coincided with a dramatic rise in crime rates, murder rates apparently doubled, and the chance of being a victim of violent crime tripled in just over a decade.
So criminals responded rationally to the lowered cost of their actions.
That's the economic interpretation presented.
What about involuntary labor? Things like jury duty or a military draft. Why is that considered inefficient from an economic standpoint?
The core issue is that involuntary labor isn't paid a price that reflects the value of its alternative uses in the broader economy. When someone is compelled to work at a specific task, their skills might actually be much more valuable doing something else in the free market.
Right.
Forcing them into a less productive role leads to a misallocation of labor from society's perspective.
So the military might get a brilliant chemist to file papers for less than a chemist's market wage, but society as a whole loses the more valuable output the chemist could have produced elsewhere.
Exactly. An all-volunteer army, on the other hand, has to pay wages competitive enough to attract individuals based on their civilian skill levels. It's more likely to use individuals whose civilian skills are less valuable for routine tasks, which better reflects the true economic cost of their labor.
The Soviet Gulag system is used as a stark, large-scale example of this inefficiency.
Yeah, I mean, the Gulag made enormous contributions to the Soviet economy in terms of raw output, timber, cobalt, gold, tin, all sorts of things. But the text argues it often did so at higher economic costs per unit of output than comparable free labor enterprises.
Like the BRICS example.
Right, bricks apparently cost more than double to produce in forced labor camps compared to nearby factories using free labor. Resources were used recklessly, which is consistent with administrators not having to pay a market price reflecting the labor's value elsewhere. They faced no real economic cost for the labor itself.
So, despite the immense human tragedy, from a purely cold economic efficiency standpoint, it was rational behavior, given the specific incentives and constraints within that horribly distorted system.
That's the chilling economic logic presented, yes.
Yeah.
The administrators had no incentive to use the labor efficiently because it was essentially free to them.
Even enslavement itself has costs, beyond the obvious moral ones.
Yes, the text points out the direct costs, capturing people, the risk of retaliation from their communities. And it's significantly more costly and difficult to enslave populations that have, say, military backing or effective organization.
So, for enslavement to be economically viable for the enslaver,
There has to be a use for the slave's labor that is valued sufficiently high to cover these costs, however minimal or brutal the calculation.
and slave prices in the Americas often reflected acquired human capital, didn't they? Like what was termed seasoning.
Absolutely. A slave purchased in the U.S. South cost far more than one purchased on the coast of Africa, and this difference wasn't just transport costs. It reflected seasoning, the acquired human capital of learning the language, the specific agricultural methods, the routines of the new setting.
And later generations.
Later generations born into slavery in the Americas commanded even higher prices because they grew up fully immersed in that environment, possessing that human capital from the start.
The stark contrast in slave population growth between Brazil, West Indies, and the U.S. is mentioned here as potentially related to incentives.
Yeah. Brazil and the West Indies imported vastly more slaves, but had very low survival and reproduction rates, meaning they needed constant, costly importation to maintain their labor force. The U.S. imported far fewer slaves historically, but saw a much larger natural growth in its resident slave population.
Suggesting.
This difference, the text suggests, points to potential economic incentives leading to different levels of treatment and conditions, perhaps related to the relative costs and benefits of ensuring slave survival and reproduction versus continuous expensive importation.
You mentioned earlier the economic principle that assets tend to move to their highest valued uses in a free market. How does the concept of freedom fit into that for an enslaved person?
Well, for the slave themselves, freedom would represent their highest economic value. A free worker, theoretically, earns the full market value of their labor. An owner only captures a portion of that value.
So the slave values their own freedom more than the owner values their labor.
The slave's potential output and earnings as a free person, receiving the full market price for their labor, would likely be higher than their net value to an owner after accounting for costs of maintenance and control. This creates an economic incentive, in theory, for the slave to buy their own freedom.
To essentially outbid the owner for their own labor.
Yes, exactly. In a theoretical free market, without insurmountable legal barriers, they could potentially earn more as a free person, and thus could, in principle, afford to purchase their freedom. And this actually happened in various historical contexts, like with the peculium in ancient Rome allowing slaves to save and purchase freedom, or instances of self-purchase on credit in parts of the Western Hemisphere.
Fascinating. Okay, let's move to the economics of medical care. The book argues that a core problem here is the perception that prices are merely a nuisance to be avoided or controlled.
That seems to be the fundamental disconnect highlighted. Prices in healthcare are often viewed primarily as obstacles to getting care, rather than as crucial signals about the underlying costs, the scarcity of resources like doctor time or equipment, and the relative value of different medical interventions.
And trying to control medical prices, like other price controls, has predictable, generally negative consequences.
Exactly. The standard outcomes of price controls tend to appear. Increased use of the service because it seems artificially cheap, people seeking care for minor things.
Uh-huh.
Reduced supply because providers aren't getting market rates to cover their costs and provide an incentive. Deterioration of quality as providers cut corners, and the emergence of black markets or informal payments to bypass the official restrictions.
And these consequences are particularly harmful in healthcare.
Especially harmful, yeah, because the stakes are literally pain, disability, and life or death.
Can you give us some specific examples cited from different countries?
Sure. In Britain, under the National Health Service, healthcare costs have grown significantly as a share of GDP over time, yet the text notes they have fewer doctors per capita than, say, Germany, which has more private options.
These quality issues.
Quality deterioration is mentioned, including issues with things like dirty hospital wards and infamous long wait times for necessary surgeries. The example given of the woman whose cancer became inoperable due to delays while she was in the queue for treatment is particularly stark.
Wow.
Also, many doctors are imported, sometimes with potentially lower quality training. The point made is, paying less but getting less in terms of timely access and quality isn't necessarily a bargain.
France is mentioned for overuse.
Yes. The system there apparently makes care artificially less expensive or free at the point of service, which leads people with relatively minor ailments to consume excessive amounts of doctor time and resources, potentially taking away from those with more serious, urgent needs.
And the former USSR system. What did the numbers hide?
Under central planning and price controls, they could boast high numbers of doctors and hospital beds per capita. But this apparently concealed terrible underlying outcomes, like rising infant mortality and declining life expectancy, which only came to light later during Glasnost. The numbers looked good on paper, but the actual quality and effectiveness of care were poor.
What about black markets in healthcare?
In countries like China and Japan with heavily controlled systems, the text describes informal, often illegal, payments going through the back door or giving gifts as being common ways to get faster or better treatment.
Which indicates
It highlights the unrecorded human costs. Maybe hasty diagnoses due to overworked doctors, long waits for those who can't or won't pay informally. It also shows how administrators in such systems can gain significant power by controlling access to care.
and the comparison between Canada and the U.S. regarding cross-border care.
It's noted that it's relatively common for Canadians to seek certain types of medical treatment in the U.S., while it's quite rare for Americans to seek treatment in Canada. This is presented as an indicator of where the quality, access, and timeliness are perceived to be better, despite official price controls in Canada and higher nominal costs in the U.S.
Third-party payments, like from insurance or government programs, also change patient behavior, don't they? Separate from price controls.
Oh, absolutely. When a third party is paying for most or all of the cost, individuals naturally have much less incentive to weigh the cost of a particular procedure or doctor visit against its actual benefit to them compared to if they were paying directly out of pocket. This tends to increase demand and utilization across the board.
The book offers a bit of a different perspective on the uninsured in the U.S. than we often hear, focusing on demographics.
Yeah, it highlights data suggesting that a significant portion of uninsured Americans are actually young adults who technically have sufficient income to afford coverage, but choose to spend their money on other things, perhaps feeling less vulnerable to serious health issues at that stage of life.
So it complicates the picture.
It counters the common portrayal of the uninsured being predominantly old or desperately poor people facing absolutely impossible choices, though obviously those situations exist too. It suggests the group is more diverse.
Malpractice lawsuits seem to have significant unintended consequences discussed in the text.
Yes, they impose substantial costs on the system, particularly through extremely high insurance premiums for certain specialties like obstetrics. In areas known for very high jury awards, these costs have reportedly led some obstetricians to stop delivering babies entirely.
So the goal of deterring malpractice and compensating victims can actually lead to fewer doctors being available to deliver babies in some areas.
That's the potential unintended consequence highlighted. The ideal, of course, is that jury awards compensate real damages and deter genuine negligence. But the reality described is juries sometimes awarding vast sums, perhaps to send message, without maybe fully considering the cascading future costs like fewer obstetricians available, which could potentially increase risk for pregnant women in those areas, or the lifetime costs associated with babies injured, perhaps because a doctor decided not to take on a particularly risky case or simply wasn't available at all. The Nevada example is cited for high awards driving doctors away.
Developing new pharmaceutical drugs is incredibly expensive, right? The R&D costs.
Huge fixed costs, yes. We're talking hundreds of millions, often billions of dollars in research and development for each new medication that actually makes it to market, and that's after accounting for the many, many expensive failures along the way.
And there's often political pressure to control drug prices, usually framed as saving money for consumers or governments.
Right. The argument is made to cap prices or allow re-exporting cheaper American drugs from places like Canada, or generally pressure companies to charge less.
But if you think beyond stage one,
Yeah.
what's the consequence of that?
If those massive fixed R&D costs can't be recouped through sales revenues, then there's a significantly reduced incentive and, frankly, ability for companies to invest in researching and discovering new medicines for future diseases.
So it impacts future innovation.
The text points out that countries with strict drug price controls consistently have lower rates of discovering major new medications compared to the U.S. The immediate saving on existing drugs comes at the potential cost of future cures and treatments not being developed.
There's also something called a fallacy of composition mentioned regarding generic drugs. How does that work?
Yes. For an individual hospital or an insurance company, substituting a generic drug for a brand name, one can save money for them right then and there. That's true. But the fallacy is in generalizing this to the whole system or long term. If policies or market pressures force prices so low that the original brand name companies cannot recoup their huge R&D costs, then the generic companies who do very little R&D themselves are essentially getting a free ride on that initial investment.
So it undermines the incentive for the initial research.
Exactly. Drastically reducing brand name profits removes the incentive for that crucial, risky R&D that leads to any new drugs existing in the first place. This ultimately impacts the pipeline for future cures for other diseases down the road.
The FDA approval process involves difficult trade-offs as well, doesn't it? Between speed and certainty.
It absolutely does. More extensive testing and larger sample sizes increase certainty about a drug's safety and effectiveness, which is obviously the clear goal.
But the downside.
But this also means longer approval times. And during that waiting period, many sick people who could potentially benefit from the drug suffer or even die waiting for it to become available. It's a constant, difficult balancing act between the desire for absolute certainty and the urgent need for timely access to potentially life-saving treatments.
And those who die waiting are often unidentifiable statistics, whereas those who suffer side effects from an approved drug are identifiable tragedies that get attention.
That's the point made. Deaths or severe reactions from known side effects are dramatic, identifiable, and often make headlines, understandably creating pressure for more caution. The statistically larger number of deaths among unidentifiable people who couldn't get a beneficial drug because it was delayed or maybe priced out of reach by regulation are less visible, less dramatic, but no less real in terms of human cost.
So summarizing the economics of medical care according to this perspective,
Attempts to avoid the financial costs of R&D ultimately risk reducing the creation of new, potentially life-saving drugs. Distorted incentives from things like price controls or third-party payments can lead to overuse and misallocation of scarce medical resources, taking time and effort away from those with genuine, serious needs. And the standard negative consequences of price controls, increased use, reduced supply, quality deterioration, black markets are uniquely devastating when applied to something as critical as medical care.
let's turn now to housing. We certainly hear a lot about housing affordability issues today. It's a huge topic.
Absolutely. Homelessness, families making incredibly difficult choices about where to live, long commutes, overcrowding, these are acknowledged serious problems in many places.
But the book argues that many political solutions intended to help have actually made things worse over time.
That's a key argument presented, yeah. Looking historically, 19th century slum clearance often just tore down existing low-income housing without building replacements, just displacing people.
And later programs.
20th century urban renewal programs apparently destroyed more low-income housing units than they replaced, and the new units built were typically too expensive for the very people who had been displaced. The argument is that, however poor the pre-existing housing might have been, it was often the best affordable option available for those tenants, allowing them to use their limited resources for other pressing needs like food or clothing.
The examples of Jewish and Italian immigrants in the past seem to support this idea of trade-offs.
Right. They often lived in incredibly poor, overcrowded conditions by today's standards, but this lower housing cost allowed them to save money, maybe bring family members over from the old country, or gradually improve their own economic situation over time. They were making rational trade-offs with their very limited resources.
And this is contrasted with later urban renewal.
Yes, contrasted with later urban renewal programs that displaced minority groups like Black Americans and Puerto Ricans, who often didn't have similar options to afford the new, more expensive housing built in its place.
And black housing improved significantly after the Civil War, largely through market forces, not government programs.
According to the text, yes. As competition for labor increased and incomes gradually rose in the decades after emancipation, Black housing standards improved significantly through ordinary market pressures, not primarily through the efforts of social reform movements or government-mandated improvements.
So when we look at high housing prices today, it's not simply a matter of high demand. The book really focuses elsewhere.
The text puts a very, very strong emphasis on the supply side, particularly restrictions on the supply of buildable land and limitations on construction.
The Palo Alto example from the 70s is quite stark on this point.
Yeah, it's striking. In the 1970s, average home prices there apparently nearly quadrupled in a single decade.
Wow.
But during that same decade, the city's population actually declined and schools were closing due to lack of enrollment. And crucially, during that entire high-growth price decade, not a single new housing unit was built in the city.
Zero new houses.
Zero. This strongly indicates that the price surge was overwhelmingly driven by severe restrictions on supply, not by some booming population or runaway demand increase.
And often in these high-cost areas, it's the value of the land itself, not necessarily the quality or size of the house, that's driving the astronomical price.
Exactly. Studies, like the MBER one mentioned, estimate that the value added by just a standard quarter-acre lot in places like coastal California or parts of New York City is astronomical compared to what that same size lot adds in areas with fewer land use restrictions, like Chicago. The cost is primarily in the land itself, made artificially scarce by regulation.
And zoning laws and other regulations are a big part of those restrictions.
Hugely significant, according to this analysis. Requirements for large minimum lot sizes, restrictions on building height, minimum parking mandates, these are all strongly correlated with higher housing prices.
And height restrictions have knock-on effects.
Height restrictions in particular tend to push development outwards horizontally, contributing to urban sprawl, longer commutes, more traffic, and other non-monetary costs like increased accidents and fatalities associated with more driving.
Banning housing completely through open space laws sounds like the most extreme form of this supply restriction.
It is, effectively. While often framed politically as preserving natural beauty or creating recreational space, the primary economic effect is simply banning building on certain parcels of land. This drastically increases the price of the remaining buildable land, as seen in places like San Mateo County near San Francisco.
And this is framed as politics substituting for the market.
It's framed as existing voters using the political process to compete for land use, basically reserving land for their preferred uses, like open space or low density, and imposing the costs, higher prices, lack of availability, on prospective future buyers or renters, often at little or no direct cost to themselves. This contrasts with allowing competition for land use to happen through the marketplace, where everyone faces the price signals and costs.
Developers are often portrayed negatively in these debates, but the book positions them differently as intermediaries.
Right. Developers generally build what a large number of other people, the potential buyers and renters, want and are willing to pay for. They're responding to market demand, not just satisfying their own architectural whims. Demonizing developers, the argument goes, is often a distraction from the real underlying competition for scarce land use, which is frequently between existing residents using the political process to restrict building and future residents trying to access housing through market mechanisms.
These high housing costs also lead to population displacement, forcing people out.
Absolutely. People are forced to move out of expensive areas like the San Francisco Peninsula, as mentioned. They then move to surrounding regions, pushing up housing prices there sometimes in areas quite far away, like Merced County in California's Central Valley.
And this connects to demographic shifts.
Yes, this displacement is linked to observed demographic shifts, such as the reported decline in the black population in expensive coastal California counties, and the corresponding expectation that minorities will soon form a majority in the Central Valley as displaced populations relocate there, seeking more affordable housing.
Rent control is another classic policy, with intended positive outcomes helping low-income tenants, but often paradoxical real-world results, according to the text.
Yes, the clear intention is to protect lower-income tenants from rising rents and keep housing affordable. But the book argues that cities with severe, long-standing rent control often end up with higher overall average rents than comparable cities without it. San Francisco is cited again as an example of a city with strict rent control also having extremely high market rents.
How does that paradox happen? Why would rent control lead to higher rents overall?
Well, several things happen. First, rent control increases demand for the rent-controlled units because the price is held below market rates. More people want them. At the same time, it reduces the supply of rental housing over the long term. Builders have less incentive to construct new rental units if their potential profits are capped, or they might shift to building luxury housing or condos, which are often exempt or less restricted.
And existing units.
And crucially, landlords have much less incentive to maintain the existing rent-controlled units. Why spend money on upkeep if you have a long waiting list of tenants willing to take the apartment as is at the legally capped rent? You don't need to compete on quality to attract or retain tenants.
So the policy aimed at helping low-income tenants can actually reduce the overall supply of affordable, well-maintained housing in the long run.
That's the paradox highlighted. It also implies, the text suggests, that reformers believe they know what's better for tenants, like specific levels of maintenance, than the tenants themselves who might rationally choose to pay less for a less well-maintained apartment if that trade-off were available in the market. Rent control removes that choice by reducing the incentive for landlords to offer various price-quality combinations.
Briefly touching on residential segregation again. The book revisits the idea that it's not always purely about abstract racial prejudice. Sometimes perceived costs play a role.
It discusses historical instances where resistance to certain immigrant groups moving into established neighborhoods seemed partly based on perceived tangible costs or negative externalities, things like higher rates of communicable disease associated with poverty and crowding at the time, or the tough, sometimes violent reputations of certain neighborhoods heavily populated by a new group.
Like the Irish example.
The example of resistance to Irish immigrants in 19th century American cities is used, partly linked to perceived issues like cholera outbreaks or the notorious toughness of neighborhoods they were associated with, like the bloody old 6th Ward in New York. The argument isn't denying prejudice existed, but suggesting that perceived economic and social costs were also factors in community resistance, and crucially, that these attitudes often changed as the group assimilated, and those perceived negative associations faded over time. It adds complexity beyond just assuming pure malice, while acknowledging government-mandated segregation absolutely existed too.
Okay, let's talk about risk and safety. It seems almost intuitive, doesn't it, that you can't possibly have too much safety. More safety is always better.
Yeah, that sounds right on the surface.
Yeah.
But the book challenges that idea directly. Reducing any risk always comes with costs. Sometimes it's financial costs, sometimes it's time, sometimes it's having to give up activities you value or enjoy.
Like driving.
Life itself involves constant risk. You can't eliminate it entirely. The relevant question isn't achieving zero risk, but balancing the degree of risk against the cost of reducing it by a certain amount. Individuals make these trade-offs, constantly choosing to drive a relatively safe car, for example, instead of a much, much safer but prohibitively expensive and impractical tank.
And decisions about risk seem fundamentally different when they're made by third parties, organizations, movements compared to when individuals make them for themselves and face the costs directly.
Crucially different, the text argues. Third parties may be advocacy groups. Sometimes government agencies often derive their influence, their funding, their reason for being from generating fear about specific risks.
So their incentive isn't necessarily balanced safety.
Their institutional incentive can easily become maximizing that fear and advocating for maximum reduction of that one specific risk without necessarily considering the costs, the alternative uses of those resources, or the overall net impact on injuries and deaths across all activities and risks.
This can lead to categorical thinking, safe versus unsafe, instead of incremental analysis. How much safer? At what cost?
Yes, exactly. Framing something simply as unsafe rather than analyzing how much a specific measure reduces risk, at what specific cost, and maybe what other risks or costs are introduced as a side effect. Ralph Nader's book, Unsafe at Any Speed, is cited as a classic example of this, using powerful rhetoric like automobile industry can't, rather than engaging directly with the factual trade-offs involved in vehicle design and cost.
And the statistics on auto fatalities were actually declining significantly when his book came out.
Yeah, apparently they were declining quite significantly, both per capita and per vehicle mile traveled, which runs counter to the implication that the auto industry was actively making cars more unsafe overall. The text notes Nader offered no real long-term data to support that particular claim, relying more on anecdotes and rhetoric.
It's incredibly difficult, though, to discuss trade-offs when dealing with highly emotional issues, like the safety of vaccines or medications for children.
It absolutely is. It's extremely sensitive. Even the most life-saving interventions can have rare, sometimes tragic side effects, just like certain common foods like peanut butter cause severe allergic reactions in a very small number of people.
Right.
But again, the point made in the text is that identifiable deaths or injuries from, say, a drug's side effects are incredibly dramatic, they make headlines, they generate strong emotional responses. The statistically much larger number of deaths among unidentifiable people who die from the disease because a beneficial drug wasn't available due to regulatory delays or cost barriers imposed in the name of safety, well, those are less visible, less dramatic, and don't generate the same kind of public outcry or media attention, but the human cost is just as real, if not greater.
And political success in the safety crusade doesn't always equate to better overall outcomes across the board.
That's the argument. Third-party safety movements, by focusing intensely on highly visible risks and often using categorical one-stage reasoning, can achieve political success. They can claim credit for improvements that might have been happening anyway due to broader factors like rising wealth, while potentially ignoring the hidden costs or negative consequences in other areas, like maybe making cars heavier and less fuel efficient, or diverting resources from other safety measures.
The General McClellan analogy.
Yeah, General McClellan's extreme caution during the Civil War, intended to save his soldiers' lives in the immediate battle, is used as an analogy. It arguably prolonged the war significantly and led to a far higher total death toll in the long run. Sometimes excessive caution in one area increases overall risk.
There's that pervasive idea, that phrase you hear. If it saves just one life, it's worth whatever it costs. How does the book address that?
The counter-argument presented is that this completely ignores the fact that wealth itself saves lives. Economic prosperity saves lives on a massive scale. Sacrificing wealth, for example, by imposing extremely costly regulations for a very small safety gain, or reducing overall economic efficiency reduces the resources available for all the myriad things wealth provides that extend and improve lives. Better nutrition, better housing, better sanitation, widespread access to medical care, general public safety measures, and so on.
So the calculation is broader.
Whether a specific safety policy makes economic sense from this perspective depends on its net impact on overall wealth and efficiency, which in turn affects overall lifespan and well-being for the population as a whole, not just focusing on one isolated risk.
How does insurance factor into managing risk in the economy?
Insurance plays an absolutely crucial role. First, it reduces the magnitude of risk for individuals by pooling losses across a large group. You pay a small premium to avoid a potentially catastrophic financial loss.
Spreads the risk.
Spreads the risk, exactly. Second, it transfers risk to entities, the insurance companies, that are specialized and better able to bear it at a lower cost.
And this has benefits.
Yeah, benefits both the companies, who can charge premiums based on assessed risk and therefore have an incentive to encourage risk reduction, like auto insurers pushing for crash tests or offering discounts for safe driving, and consumers making potentially risky but valuable activities like driving or owning a home more affordable, and influencing manufacturers to build safer products.
And it reduces the total amount of resources held idle globally, just in case of disaster.
Right. By pooling risk across vast numbers of people and businesses, insurance allows resources to be used productively in the economy instead of being held individually, or by businesses just sitting there as reserves to guard against potential catastrophic losses. Global reinsurance companies like Swiss Re, who insure insurance companies against massive risks worldwide like floods in China or major earthquakes, They exemplify this global pooling effect.
And Swiss Re's reputation.
Yeah, the text mentions its reputation was built partly on its swift and full payout after the devastating 1906 San Francisco earthquake and fire, which really reinforced trust in the system's ability to manage and transfer even enormous risks.
But government regulation of insurance can sometimes complicate things,
Ah.
overriding the economics.
Yes. State-level regulation, in particular, often prioritizes political definitions of fairness over the economic realities of risk assessment.
Like forcing safe drivers to subsidize unsafe drivers by keeping premiums artificially similar.
Exactly. By preventing insurers from charging significantly higher premiums to drivers with statistically much higher risks, like multiple DUIs or speeding tickets, regulators effectively force lower-risk drivers to pay more than their own risk profile would warrant in order to cover the expected higher costs generated by the high-risk drivers.
Which leads to things like high-risk pools.
Right. These state-mandated high-risk pools emerge, which insurance companies are often forced to cover at regulated, below-cost rates, driving up the rates for everyone else in the regular pool. The New Jersey example is used, whereas regulators kept rates artificially low for high-risk drivers. The state's high-risk pool apparently ballooned from about 12% of drivers to nearly half of all drivers in the state.
Wow. So policies intended to promote fairness in premiums can end up distorting incentives, increasing overall risk, and raising costs for the majority of drivers.
By interfering with accurate risk-based pricing, regulation can exacerbate well-known insurance market problems like moral hazard, where the insured might take more risks because they're covered, and adverse selection, where those at the highest risk are the most likely to seek insurance. While these are acknowledged potential problems even in a free market, the text suggests that this kind of regulation often makes them worse by further distorting the price signals and incentives.
Okay, let's shift focus now to the economic development of nations. The book notes right away that vast economic disparities between regions and countries aren't a new phenomenon at all.
Not at all. Huge differences in wealth, technology, and overall development have existed throughout recorded history. Think about comparing ancient China at its peak to contemporaneous Europe, or the Roman Empire versus the Britons. The gap between wealthy Western nations and much of the Third World today is really a continuation of this long-standing historical pattern, not something entirely unique to the last century or two.
What's a crucial factor in development that's often overlooked, according to the text? Effective government is mentioned, but something else too.
Yes, effective government is certainly vital, either positively by providing law, order, stable currency, basic infrastructure, or negatively, by actively hindering development through corruption or instability, like the collapse of the Roman Empire, plunging Europe into centuries of decline. But a factor the text particularly emphasizes as being absolutely crucial and often severely underestimated or ignored is secure, legally enforceable property rights.
Why are clear legal property rights so important, especially for ordinary people in developing countries?
Because without them, millions, perhaps billions of people in developing countries cannot convert their existing physical assets, the homes they live in, often built without formal title, the small, unauthorized businesses they operate into financial assets. They lack the clear legal titles needed to use these assets as collateral for loans, get credit, or even get reliable insurance.
So their assets are frozen.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Hernando de Soto is quoted vividly describing how this freezes assets, trapping people in a kind of grubby basement of the economy where they can only do business locally with people who know and trust them personally, rather than being able to leverage their assets to engage in larger formal markets, get investment capital, or expand.
And this is contrasted with the focus on foreign aid.
Yes. The argument made is that foreign aid often flows primarily to political elites and governments. Secure property rights, on the other hand, by empowering millions of ordinary individuals to unlock the value of their existing assets and participate fully in the formal economy, could potentially provide vastly more capital for development from within the country than even a massive increase in foreign aid coming from the outside. It empowers the grassroots.
Geography also plays a significant, often really underestimated role in long-term development patterns.
A very large role, yes. Things like the presence or absence of navigable waterways are presented as critical. Europe's extensive coastline, its numerous natural harbors, and its network of navigable rivers facilitated trade, communication, and cultural exchange over centuries, allowing ideas and goods to spread relatively easily.
Compared to Africa.
Compared to Africa, which has a much smoother coastline with fewer natural harbors and fewer major navigable rivers penetrating the interior, This historically limited the reach of sea-based trade and the development of large coastal urban centers connected to the hinterland. Highland transport costs effectively shrink the size of economic and cultural universes where water transport isn't readily available.
Climate matters too, obviously.
Hugely. Factors like the Gulf Stream warming Western Europe compared to regions at similar latitudes are significant. Differences in temperature, rainfall patterns like rain shadows, soil quality, all these determine agricultural possibilities, and thus the kinds of skills and ways of life that tend to develop in different regions, even within continents, like the historical differences noted between northern and southern Italians.
And winds and currents for sailing.
Prevailing winds and ocean currents were absolutely critical for historical trade routes and maritime exploration and capabilities. Local knowledge, like understanding the Asian monsoons, versus adapting to entirely new conditions, like Mediterranean sailors facing the Atlantic.
So these deep geographical factors create vastly different starting points, resource endowments, and constraints that influence development trajectories over very long periods.
And they demand different skills, different technologies, different social organizations to thrive. It's not a level playing field geographically.
The book critiques several popular, often overly simple theories for these vast economic disparities. Overpopulation is one.
Yes, the overpopulation theory is addressed. The argument presented is that empirically, it often doesn't hold up. In fact, very low population density can be a barrier to development, making it extremely expensive to provide necessary services like roads, schools, or electricity grids per person.
So density can be good.
Up to a point, yes. While there are ultimate physical limits to the planet's resources, the text argues that rising prices would signal scarcity long before those absolute limits are actually reached, making the simple too many people theory not a very practical guide for policy. And famine, often attributed simplistically to overpopulation, is frequently man-made, caused by things like war, political oppression, or disastrous economic policies, as seen tragically in the Soviet Union or China under Mao.
Why does the theory persist then?
The suggestion is that the theory remains popular despite contrary evidence, partly because it's simple, it's often melodramatic, and perhaps crucially, it provides an external rationale for exercising control over other populations or societies.
And what about the exploitation theory, particularly blaming colonialism for underdevelopment?
This theory is also countered with historical examples. Spain and Portugal amassed vast colonial empires, yet remained relatively poor compared to other European nations. Countries without significant colonies like Germany, Switzerland, and Scandinavia became highly prosperous. Japan's extensive conquests in Asia did not ensure its long-term prosperity after World War II.
It was more complex.
The argument is that the simple exploitation narrative ignores the multitude of other complex, interacting factors, geography, culture, institutions, internal policies, human capital, that are responsible for development disparities. It's rarely just one thing.
So there seemed to be a persistent demand for simple, often emotionally satisfying explanations for these incredibly complex global disparities.
Yes, a demand for easy narratives, often assigning blame clearly. But perhaps, the text implies, without a corresponding widespread demand for the really painstaking, rigorous study of history, geography, economics, and culture that is necessary to truly understand the complexities involved.
Finally, let's touch on the topic of discrimination. The book suggests right off the bat that discussions on this topic are often severely hindered by unclear and shifting language, ambiguous terms.
That's presented as a central problem, yes. Terms are used ambiguously, often blurring the critical lines between internal qualities that individuals possess, like their skills, education, experience, work habits, versus external barriers imposed upon them by others due to prejudice.
Can you give an example of that confusion?
Saying someone lacks access or opportunity, when the more accurate description might be that they currently lack the developed capabilities required to succeed in a particular role or field. That's presented as an example of this linguistic confusion. It makes it very difficult to even identify the actual source of the problem, let alone discuss evidence clearly or formulate effective solutions.
And there are competing definitions of discrimination itself at play.
Yes. Historically, the initial legal definition, embodied in things like the U.S. Civil Rights Act of 1964, focused on treating individuals differently based solely on their group membership, race, religion, sex, etc. Affirmative action, in its original conception, meant proactive efforts to ensure individuals were judged solely on their individual merit without regard to group identity.
But another definition emerged.
Right. A competing definition gained prominence: focusing not on individual treatment but on group outcomes or statistical representation. If a group's statistics, like their percentage in a particular workforce or university, don't match their percentage in the general population profile, this is taken as evidence of discrimination, even if it can be shown that individuals within that process were treated the same based on objective qualifications or merit. This outcome-based definition was apparently being debated even before the 1964 Act was passed.
The book also looked at the economic cost of discrimination. Not the cost to the victim, but the cost to the discriminator.
Right. Discrimination isn't free. It imposes costs on the person or entity doing the discriminating. But the magnitude of this cost varies significantly depending on the market context.
How so?
In highly competitive markets, discrimination is argued to be very expensive. If you refuse to hire the most productive workers just because they belong to a certain group, or refuse to sell to customers from that group, you put yourself at a competitive disadvantage against less discriminatory rivals who will hire the best talent and serve all paying customers.
The South Africa example.
The South African apartheid era is used as an example where, despite intense government pressure, market competition apparently made discrimination too costly for some businesses who sought exemptions or found ways around the rules to hire needed labor regardless of race.
But regulated monopolies or government entities might face a lower cost to discriminate. They don't face the same competitive pressure.
Exactly. Because they often don't face direct market competition, they can more easily afford to indulge prejudices or respond to political pressures to discriminate. Monopolies might be able to pass on the higher costs of inefficiency from not hiring the most qualified people to consumers via regulated rates. Government entities, particularly in non-democratic systems or where political patronage is strong, might face strong political incentives to discriminate without suffering immediate economic losses in the same way a competitive business would.
Examples given.
Examples like telephone companies discriminating in hiring before the civil rights era forced changes, or governments in places like pre-war Poland reportedly not hiring qualified Jewish doctors for government positions, are mentioned.
The difficulty in comparing individuals from different groups as truly the same, even if they have, say, the same degree, is also raised as a major complexity.
Yes. Even if two people have the same level of degree, factors like the quality of the institution they attended, the rigor of their specific program, their family background and home environment, presence of books, parental literacy, emphasis on education, their age, their marital status, their years of relevant work experience, all these things can be very different and significantly impact the qualifications and productivity.
So just comparing group averages isn't enough.
Attributing differences in average pay or occupational outcomes between groups solely to employer discrimination based on group membership, without rigorously accounting for these potentially large differences in relevant underlying variables, is argued to be a logical leap, a non sequitur.
There's a specific study mentioned about comparable black and white faculty members in academia.
Yes, a study is cited which found that by the early 1970s, black faculty members who were statistically comparable to their white counterparts on key variables like publication records, the ranking of their PhD granting institution, and years of professional experience were actually earning, on average, more than their comparable white colleagues.
What does that suggest?
It suggests that, at least in that specific context at that time, differences in those specific measures of human capital and qualifications, rather than discrimination at the point of hiring or pay setting for similarly qualified individuals, could explain a significant portion of the observed aggregate differences in earnings between the groups overall.
Anti-discrimination laws themselves, especially those focused on achieving specific group statistical outcomes rather than just equal individual treatment, can have unintended negative consequences too, according to this analysis.
That's a major point. If employers face significant legal risk, like lawsuits or government sanctions, for not having a workforce whose demographic profile statistically mirrors the local population, regardless of the applicant pool's qualifications, it creates a powerful incentive for them over time to avoid locating new businesses or expanding existing ones in areas with high concentrations of specific minority groups.
Why? To avoid the legal risk.
To avoid the heightened legal risk and compliance costs associated with potential statistical disparities. So the policy aimed at ensuring representation in workplaces could, perversely, end up reducing the number of total job opportunities available in those very communities over the long run.
So the crucial empirical question, which the text suggests is seldom asked directly, is:
do anti-discrimination laws, particularly those focused on statistical outcomes, on net balance, actually increase or decrease the overall employment levels and economic opportunities for the minority groups they are intended to help? Once you consider all these complex incentives and potential unintended consequences they create for employers.
That's a question of the net effect.
Exactly. It's an empirical question about the real-world results, not just the intentions.
And the very vocabulary we use to discuss discrimination seems to be part of the problem in getting clear answers, according to the book.
Yes, the argument is that the current common vocabulary makes it incredibly difficult to even measure discrimination accurately, let alone understand its causes and consequences, because the language itself tends to lump together the distinct effects of actual discrimination, differential treatment of comparable individuals, with the effects of numerous other factors, like differences in human capital, cultural patterns, age distributions, etc., under ambiguous umbrella terms like disparity or underrepresentation.
Making it hard to separate causes.
The language, it's argued, is often better suited for political mobilization or moral condemnation than for facilitating clear, objective, empirical investigation and nuanced understanding of complex social phenomena.
Wow, that's certainly a lot to think about across all these different areas. We've covered quite a bit how those seemingly small incremental decisions stack up. The absolutely fundamental importance of thinking beyond that first, most visible stage of consequences.
That, and then what will
The
happen?
other question. Exactly. And how incentives, whether they're political, economic, or even the incentives that criminals face, profoundly shape behavior and outcomes, often in unexpected ways.
Yeah, and the critical role of prices in conveying reality, especially when attempts to control or ignore them backfire, as we saw discussed in healthcare and housing examples.
Right. And the often overlooked complex factors involved in national economic development and in understanding discrimination, moving beyond simple narratives. Plus, the inherent trade-offs involved in pursuing risk reduction and safety.
It all seems to point back to that core idea, doesn't it? Looking past the stated intentions and the immediate goals to really try and trace the actual chain of cause and effect, following the incentives and constraints wherever they lead, often over many stages and many years.
So, what does this all mean for you, the listener, trying to navigate a world that's full of complex problems, but also full of loud, often very simple-sounding solutions being offered?
Well, perhaps the most valuable tool isn't immediately jumping to adopt one side's simple narrative, but maybe cultivating the discipline to consistently ask that persistent, fundamental question.
And then what will happen?
Yeah. And then having the intellectual honesty and the willingness to follow those consequences, empirically and logically, even if the path isn't simple or emotionally satisfying or politically convenient.
Or maybe another takeaway is to reflect critically on whether the language we commonly use to discuss these vital issues, things like fairness, safety, poverty, prosperity, is actually helping us understand the world more clearly, or if it might sometimes be inadvertently trapping us in cycles of misunderstanding and talking past each other.
That's a really crucial question to consider, isn't it? How our words shape our thinking.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.